kill switch on the parliamentary procedure known as the filibuster in the United States Senate. Adam is the executive director of 𝗣cie𝗹𝗶𝘁𝗄 and a former deputy chief of staff to Senator Harry Reid. He's also now a columnist for GQ and frequent political commentator on MSNBC. Before I turn it over to tonight's moderator, Professor Deondra Rose, we have a colleague, Bruce Jentleson, who just happens to be the author's father, and we thought it would be appropriate for him to kick things off with a few words. So Bruce, take it away.
Thanks very much, Mac, and thanks to Deondra and the whole Polis team for setting up this event. So I get to do lots of intros, but this one's actually quite special. And I'm going to do it with my two hats on, my dad hat and my professor hat. So first with my dad hat, and I know I speak for Barbara as well about how proud we are of what Adam has accomplished, the book itself, and the incredible attention and powerful impact it's been having. Just pick up your New York Times today, or almost any day, and he's quoted at great length on these issues there. It's also the case that he's kind of become my personal Facebook page. I mean, he's been on TV and podcasts and everything so much that I get like notes from people I went to high school with saying, hey, it must be your son. He looks like you. And of course, I tell them that if he stood up, you'd see he's a lot taller than I am, and that he actually gets his legs from his mom's side of the family with two brothers well over 6'2". But what I really want folks to understand about Adam's work and his career choices, it's very much his own. I mean, sure, growing up in a family like ours was a factor, interested in politics and policy, but he didn't really set out on this road after college. He went to Columbia, he was a history major. And a year or so after graduating, he really made the decision to get involved in politics and policy as work that he really believed in. It's kind of a message for students that are with us tonight. You know, as you think about your career choices, the best advice, I think, is to choose something that you really care about and you believe in, and you'll be really good at it. And to pursue career paths meaningful for you. So Adam started out in presidential campaigns. He worked for the DC-based Center for American Progress. And as Max said, he spent about 6 or 7 years on the staff of Senate Majority and Minority Leader Harry Reid, first as Deputy Communications Director, then as Communications Director, and then ultimately as Deputy Chief of Staff. After Senator Reid retired in 2017, he worked for an organization called 𝗖𝗲𝗁𝐶𝗂𝗁, and then now, as Max said, he's the Executive Director and really co-founder of 𝗣cie𝗹𝗶𝘁𝗂𝗁. He's written a lot of op-eds and articles that lead into the book. So let me quickly put the professor hat on and say a word about the book. It really is, speaking as a professor now, I can't say I'm totally biased, but being as objective as I can. It's a wonderful blend of serious scholarly research on history and political science with his own incredible experiences through his career working for Senator Reid and other aspects of it. Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist, had him on his podcast and called it blistering and persuasive. Julian Zelizer, a distinguished professor of political at Princeton, complimented not only on the quality of the historical and political science research, but, quote, a path forward that can help our government work again. Heather McGhee called it a damning account of how a tool honed to maintain white supremacy, the filibuster, has come to cost us all. A theme, by the way, in a broader sense of her own new excellent book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. If Mitch McConnell were to write a review, it might have a different tone, but anyway, we'll leave that for the conversation. So welcome, Adam. Thank you. And over to you, Deondra.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And thank you, Adam, so much for being with us tonight. We are so thrilled to have you here. So to offer a very brief overview, Adam and I will chat about Kill Switch for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A. So please do be thinking about any question that you would like to pose to Adam, and he is willing to take those questions on for the second half of our discussion. So please do send those questions to me or to our Polis fellow, Adam Worrell, who you can see in the chat function. So please do use the chat function to submit your questions for Adam. So Adam, again, welcome to Duke. We're delighted to have you here with us this evening. And to start us off, I just want to say, you know, as a political scientist and as a political historian who studies political institutions, this really is a masterpiece. And this, I've really enjoyed reading Kill Switch and am delighted to have the opportunity to chat with you about it. And I wonder, Adam, can you start us off by giving us just an overview of 𝗙𝗪𝗁 and maybe share with us some of the highlights, the main points that you make in the book?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you, Deondra, for having me. Thank you, Dad, for hosting. And thank you to the Duke community for having me here today. This is a great pleasure, and it's very exciting to be here. And I appreciate all the kind words. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that to the extent that I've gone down this path, it's because of the father I've been lucky to have. So not to get sentimental, but it's been a real pleasure. So anyway, I will switch to the book now. I think if there's one thing I try to get across in the book, it's that the Senate is an institution that likes to wrap itself in its own myths. And these myths are sometimes true and actually connected to actual Senate tradition, but more often than not, they are sort of made up and self-serving. And I think that what the book tries to do is show how, through the history of the Senate, a series of very self-interested power plays by a series of obstructionist, primarily conservative and often reactionary and white supremacist senators and obstructionists throughout history have caused the Senate to go from the deliberative institution that the framers intended it to be to the paralytic, obstructionist, gridlock-inducing institution that we see today. I think the Senate is a unique institution in American life in that it looks nothing like what the framers intended it to be. I think if the framers could see the House of Representatives today, they would think it was a little bit different, but generally sort of what they intended it to be. The presidency, the same. Obviously, there's balances of power and things that are different, but fundamentally, they sort of look like they were intended to be. The Senate looks nothing like what it was meant to be. I'm not an originalist. I certainly don't think that the framers were right about many things, but I do think they created a system that was designed to be able to change and adapt. But today it cannot do that. It is paralyzed from changing, it is paralyzed from adapting, and it is quickly on the verge of becoming a failed institution. And I think what the book tries to show is how we got here and what can be done to fix it. And just briefly to run through some of the main points, I think we start with the framers and establishing that the filibuster was not part of the Constitution and was definitely not part of the framers' vision. In fact, they opposed the idea of a filibuster. They opposed supermajority thresholds. They opposed the idea of debate as obstructive rather than persuasive. They placed clear limits on Senate debate. They wanted debate to be thoughtful, but they also wanted it to be pertinent and to the point. And they didn't think senators should be able to go on at length. That changed with John Calhoun's arrival in the Senate in the middle of the 19th century. He innovated what we would sort of describe today as the talking filibuster. His explicit intent in innovating this was to increase the power of the minority from where James Madison had set it at the idea that the minority should have a voice and a veto and involvement in the process. Calhoun wanted to expand that power and increase the power of the minority from a voice to a veto. He was explicit about this. He wrote about it in his disquisition on government. There's a whole section in that entitled "Insufficient Power for the Minority." And he explained that he wanted to give every part of the community a veto over all the others. But he was only able to create a talking filibuster that was capable of delaying. This was a radical innovation at the time. I don't want to give him short shrift. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, when he saw what Calhoun was doing, rose up and immediately tried to undo it and do what we would today describe as going nuclear and get rid of the filibuster. But even as powerful and as radical as Calhoun's innovation was, it still only was really capable of delaying what the majority wanted to do. And just to be clear about this, Calhoun's explicit motivation was that he saw that if the majority was allowed to continue its march towards progress, it was going to abolish slavery. So his distinct motivation, and he made no bones about this, for trying to increase the power of the minority was to preserve slavery and increase the power of the slaveholding class that he represented as a senator from South Carolina. Fast forward to the Jim Crow era, senators again faced imminent progress on civil rights, bills to combat lynching, to end poll taxes, and to combat workplace discrimination started passing the House of Representatives and arriving over in the Senate, where they clearly had majority support, and they had presidents of both parties ready and willing to sign them. There was a bill to end poll taxes that had all of these conditions, sort of what we think of as necessary for a bill to become a law, as early as 1891. So Southern white supremacists of that era, again, needed to increase the power of the minority to stop this progress. They were able to start grafting onto the filibuster this supermajority threshold that we're familiar with today. And so that is when the filibuster acquired the power, not just to delay bills, but to block them and stop them altogether. This ability to stop and block was only applied to civil rights from the end of Reconstruction until 1964, when Lyndon Johnson broke the first Southern filibuster against civil rights. And I just want to pause there for 1 second to emphasize that during this period, the Senate, from the founding to 1964, the Senate remained a majority rule institution. Bills passed or failed based on whether they could secure a majority. The one exception was civil rights. So during this era where we built the post-war America, the Great Society, the New Deal, every bill that passed that did these good things passed or failed based on whether it could secure a majority. Only civil rights was forced to clear this supermajority threshold. Fast forward to today, and we have a Senate where this supermajority threshold has become normalized, not because of any affirmative decision that the Senate made, but rather because of a series of sort of backsliding into this normalization that was done by both parties, but really seized and put on supercharged by Senator Mitch McConnell under Barack Obama. But there's no coincidence that now today you see the same supermajority threshold being applied to all issues as was applied to only civil rights. And just like civil rights was delayed for 100 years because it had to clear the supermajority threshold, we see every other issue facing gridlock. We don't lack action on things like climate change, income inequality, voting rights for lack of pragmatic bipartisan solutions. We have plenty of those that have broad support out there in the public when it comes to bipartisanship, but they can't pass because they can't clear a supermajority threshold in the Senate. And so what the book argues is that this supermajority threshold was not an affirmative decision. It is not a grand Senate tradition. It is something that we sort of backslid into over several decades, and that should change. And I say in the book, it's not an uplifting history. But the good news is that it's actually relatively easy to change this rule. It only takes a vote of a majority of senators, something they can do at any time. So if we want to make change here, all we have to do is have the political will to have 50 senators plus the vice president vote to make that change.
Oh my gosh, this is so rich. There's so much here, and I'm excited to unpack as much as we can. And so, but just to start, Adam, if I can ask you, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your title, Kill Switch. So, I have to say that your book and everything you have just described, it reflects a really bold and provocative characterization of the Senate that is very much contra to a lot of what I am used to hearing. Oftentimes we get this very laudatory language about the Senate being, the world's greatest deliberative body. It's a genteel institution. It's esteemed. And yet, you paint a very powerful picture of a legislative wasteland that is riddled with failure. And early on, you say, as America faces enormous challenges, the Senate has become a kill switch that cuts off broad-based solutions and shuts down our democratic process. I mean, I'm sure that, like many people listening, I see that as a big red flag waving. And so I just love to hear a little bit about how are people responding to this when you're doing your book tour? Are you met with a lot of surprise? Are people resistant to this characterization of the Senate? I feel like there's a lot of romanticization of the Senate, like you mentioned. So what are people saying? How are they responding?
Well, it's an interesting time to be, talking about this book. I mean, I think people are generally have been very receptive. And one of the things that I've been surprised by, and I'm not saying this is related to the book, but I think that the perception of the Senate has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. I think even in the beginning of the Obama administration, there was still a general sense that it was this, the cooling saucer of myth. And I think, Senator McConnell and other Republican senators did a good job sort of propping up that myth and keeping it going. And I think that that's shifted. I think that, you see even conservative columnists like David Brooks or David Frum in the Atlantic Monthly saying, look, if Biden faces obstruction, he should probably get rid of the filibuster. And I think this idea that there is some wisdom in the Senate's ability to impose delay has decreased dramatically. I think that people are much more willing to see it for what it is, which is just another political body of people making, self-interested decisions, which I don't think is a shock to anybody who studies politics. But I do think that that myth has been it's gone away in a lot of ways. And I think honestly, you could probably attribute a lot of that to Senator McConnell. I think that he was always very successful. And in the book, I try to show what makes him tick. I try to, not be too critical of him, although I am very critical. But I'm more interested not in casting him as a total villain, but actually showing what makes him tick. And I think that he was very successful in his nearly 40-year Senate career at cloaking himself in this institutionalism and trying to convey the idea that what he was doing was in the best interest of the Senate. But I think that his ability to do that in the post-Trump era has gone away. Everybody saw him rally behind Trump. Everybody saw him protect Trump through 2 impeachment trials. There were other episodes like when Trump made a power grab to declare an emergency declaration to seize funding from Congress. McConnell was expected to perhaps stand up to Trump in that episode, and he did not. So I think that this ability to cloak itself in this myth has gone away dramatically. And the title sort of came from that idea of the cooling saucer. It's what you're told all the time when you're working in the Senate, that even though it's frustrating, even though it can be slow and glacial in its pace, that there's wisdom in this delay, and that it's performing this role of the cooling saucer. And once you start doing the research and you look at civil rights, for example, and you say, I sort of came to it the idea that maybe America wasn't ready for civil rights until 1964. Maybe there would have been a public backlash. Maybe it just wasn't possible. But then you look at the history and you see that no, in fact, both chambers of Congress were ready to pass civil rights. Presidents of both parties were ready to sign it. Republicans in many ways were more aggressive on civil rights than Democrats at the time. And the public was ready too. Gallup started polling the issue of civil rights in the 1930s, and they found 72% of Americans in support of anti-lynching laws. In the 1940s, they found upwards of 60% of Americans in favor of anti-poll tax laws. And so Americans were ready. The Senate didn't perform any wise function by delaying civil rights for several decades. All they did was perpetuate the reign of terror we call Jim Crow at a cost of that's incalculable in human life. So there was no wisdom there. It was simply self-interested delay on the part of white supremacists, Southerners, senators of the South. And so I was writing the book in my basement, and I was looking at my electrical box, and I was trying to think of things that shut down a system. And inside an electrical box is that switch that's called the kill switch that shuts down the whole system. And so one day, sitting there staring at that box as I was daydreaming about something or had a writer's block, that's where I arrived at the title, because I thought it provided a contrast to this idea of a cooling saucer.
That's fantastic. It's a great title too, Adam, by the way. So, one of the things as you said a moment ago, that especially in the last decade, we've been thinking very differently about the filibuster, about the Senate, about our institutions. And I think you make a really compelling case that addressing problems presented by the filibuster is a really important first step in moving toward, becoming a more doing a better job of being a democracy or aspiring to democracy. And I'm wondering, just in terms of all of the structural or institutional challenges that we're facing, I wonder how you compare, say, addressing the filibuster to other sort of less than democratic forces of our government and institutions, like gerrymandering or restrictions on voter access. If we were thinking of priorities, would you say that the filibuster ranks above these others in your opinion, or what's your take on that?
It's a good, yeah. I mean, I'm biased, but I would say that I think that it is probably the top priority, and the only reason I would place it above other things is that I think it is the gateway to many of these other things. I think that many of those other types of reforms cannot be addressed as long as the filibuster remains in place. We are, the House of Representatives just passed H.R. 1, voting rights bill. It's going to come over to the Senate. The Senate will bring it up in the next few weeks, and it will probably be blocked. And so, the federal government will be unable to address the voter suppression that we see going on. We saw it in the last election. We've seen states since that election start to triple down on voter suppression efforts. But to combat voter suppression, the federal government will be powerless until we pass this bill, and this bill won't pass until we get rid of the filibuster. You look at structural issues like the Senate itself and its overrepresentation of rural, predominantly white populations, which is a function of its equal representation for every state. That can't be addressed until we get rid of the filibuster. One way to address it would be to pass statehood for the District of Columbia and potentially Puerto Rico. You've got a state in Wyoming that has about 600,000 people who are almost entirely white, that has 2 senators, and then you've got the District of Columbia that has about the same size population, slightly bigger, but its population is predominantly Black and brown, and it has 0 senators. And so one way to address the Senate's disproportionate representation of rural white populations is to pass statehood for things like DC, for states like DC and Puerto Rico. So, I don't think it's necessarily, in the grand scheme of things, more important than those other issues, but I do think that you can't address those other issues in large part until you get rid of the filibuster.
So Adam, there's a lot of variation in how we understand the filibuster. So one of the questions, I was talking to our Polis Directors Fellows about this recently, and they were saying that one of the questions that they and their peers often hear about is just confusion related to what on earth is the filibuster. And I have to say, one of the things I love about your book is that you talk about just even differences in how it works. Like there's, I don't want to call it like the lazy filibuster, but even just kind of this new threat of filibuster that doesn't look anything like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or this, sort of glamorized filibuster that's very labor intensive. So I wonder, could you give us a crash course? What on earth is the filibuster? How does it look when it's in action?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in the beginning, there was no filibuster. The Senate at its inception did not have senators giving long speeches that were intended to obstruct. And the framers were very clear about this. And there was no supermajority threshold either. The Senate was entirely majority rule. The reason the framers created it this way is they had just had firsthand experience with the Articles of Confederation, where there was a supermajority threshold for most major pieces of legislation in Congress. And that was a disaster. They put the supermajority threshold there in the first place because they thought, oh, this will help promote cooperation and build consensus, but it didn't work that way. Instead, it gave the minority the ability to throw a monkey wrench and block anything the majority wanted to pass. And so they said, okay, we're not doing that again. So they created the Senate as a majority rule institution. They were very clear about this. They reserved the supermajority threshold specifically for things like constitutional amendments, removal from office, and treaties, so sort of extraordinary circumstances at the time. And then the Senate, and then they set a bunch of limits on debate. There was a 2-speech rule that every senator should only be able to give 2 speeches on a given topic. Thomas Jefferson, when he was vice president, wrote a whole manual of congressional procedure where he was very clear that senators were not supposed to speak superfluously or tediously or beside the question. The ethic of the Senate was, we will debate an issue at length, we'll be thoughtful, but we'll also be respectful of each other's time. And then when everybody can sort of see that the debate is done, we'll move on and we'll bring the bill up for an up or down vote on a majority. So there was no filibuster at the beginning, and they adhered to that ethic for about half a century. It started to come into existence with John Calhoun in the 1830s. And what it looked like then was about what you would think of when you probably think of the filibuster and you think of Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It was senators on the floor, giving a long speech. It often wouldn't just be one senator. That is a bit of a sort of pop culture myth. There are individual filibusters that went on for a long time throughout history. We think of 𝗲𝗏𝗏's filibuster against the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, but more generally, it would be sort of a coordinated effort where, a group of, 15 to 20 senators would coordinate amongst themselves, and, one guy would give a speech and he'd pass the baton off to the other guy. And by passing the baton, they were able to keep it going for days or weeks at a time. But it's really important to emphasize that even as that started to emerge, there was still a strong prevailing ethic that eventually the majority would rule. Throughout the 19th century, this talking filibuster defeated almost only a handful of bills for the entire century. Often you could use it to force the majority into difficult choices or push them up against a deadline or something like that. But very rarely would it actually stop a bill altogether. And it's important to note, too, that as it came into existence, it was given this name filibuster, which is an anglicization of a Dutch word for piracy. And the sort of anglicized version of that word is freebooter. And piracy was a big issue at the time. There's a lot of piracy off the Caribbean coast. There were pirates going into the coast of Louisiana. But it was given this name because it was perceived as being something disruptive and outsidery and not part of the original Senate. So as it started to come into existence, it already had a negative connotation. And then that talking filibuster basically continued through the first half of the 20th century. And I think, you can think of the 1964 filibuster against the Civil Rights Act, which took about 2.5 months, was televised every night. Roger Mudd made his career by giving updates from the Capitol steps on CBS News about the progress of that filibuster, but that also was senators on the floor talking. It started to turn into what we see today in the 1970s, and this was sort of a management issue. The Senate's workload started to grow. New agencies in government were being created, like the EPA. The challenge of being a majority leader and managing the floor got really hard. And so as a majority leader, you started to think, well, I don't want to bring a bill to the floor if it's going to run into one of these month-long talking filibusters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to canvass my caucus ahead of time and say, is anybody plan on filibustering this bill that I'm about to bring forward? And someone would say, yeah, actually, I'm planning to filibuster it. And then the majority would say, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to bring it forward. You guys go work out your issue. I don't want this to jam up all the other business behind it. And that started the tradition that we have today, where Senate leaders run what's called a hotline, where every time they're considering a bill, they send an email, literally, to all of the offices in their caucus, basically saying, if anybody's planning to filibuster, let me know. Inevitably, in today's Senate, someone writes back and says, yes, I'm planning to filibuster. And it's that email that raises the threshold for passing a bill from simple majority, where technically it still is today, to the requirement of getting 60 votes. That 60 vote requirement, just to be clear, is not to pass the bill. It's to end the debate stage. It's to impose what's called cloture, which you could think of as closure. The two terms used to be used interchangeably, but bring closure to the debate. Every bill, once it's introduced, before it passes, has to go through this debate stage. It's a requirement. You can't skip it. And to end that debate stage, you have to have a 60 vote threshold to cut off debate. So by sending that email, ironically, what the senator is saying is that they're reserving the right to continue debating the bill. But of course, anybody who's observed the Senate for any small length of time can see that they don't actually debate the bill. They've just decided that this is a way to impose a higher threshold for passage. So, the filibuster today, you will never see people on the floor doing the Jimmy Stewart thing. Even occasionally when you see them sort of performatively doing this, like Ted Cruz reading Green Eggs and Ham a few years ago, that's just a performance. They don't actually have to do it, because if Ted Cruz had stopped talking, he still would have had the ability to raise the threshold to that 60 vote hurdle. So it's what the filibuster has become is it's become more user-friendly. No one has to put in the effort to actually go to the floor and talk about it, but it's also more powerful, because instead of just delaying a bill, you can raise the threshold for how many votes it takes to pass that bill, and you raise it to 60 votes, which today is enough to kill most bills from ever passing.
Wow. Okay. Now, I'm sure, like everyone in the audience, I feel completely well-versed now. So thank you for that crash course, Adam. So this morning, the New York Times reported that Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader in the US Senate, issued a warning about proposed filibuster reform. And he said that the majority will come after other rules next if they're successful in coming after the filibuster, that perhaps the repeal of Rule 22, the filibuster, would be the first domino of many until the Senate fails to be distinct from the House in any respect. So Adam, I'm wondering, can you speak to this issue of the filibuster's fusion with the identity of the Senate? So I know you've spoken to this a little bit, but I think, again, this idea that it's part and parcel of what makes the Senate, even when it's such a debilitating force in our legislative institutions. So, to what extent is that myth, or something that we really need to think about in terms of our prospects of fixing the situation, and maybe what would the Senate look like without it?
So to Senator McConnell's point, I think that what I would say to that is that, if the Senate is not the Senate without a 60 vote threshold, then you really have to answer the question of what was the Senate for the 200 plus years between its founding and the 70s and 80s, when there was no supermajority threshold. in any regular use, and filibusters were infrequent on every issue except for civil rights. So the idea that the filibuster is what makes the Senate, I think, is belied by the Senate's own history, because for the vast majority of its own history, it didn't have the filibuster in any frequent use. And was only really used to maintain white supremacy and the oppression of Black Americans. So I think that the Senate managed to be different from the House and managed to foster compromise and bipartisanship without the filibuster. And I think there's a strong argument to be made. Well, actually, there's another part of your question I want to answer before I go to this, which is that I think that the question of how much of this is myth, I think the Senate in a lot of ways is an institution that's lost track of its own identity. It's sort of lost the thread on itself. It doesn't exist as an institution to preserve its own rules. It exists to pass thoughtful solutions to the challenges that we as a country face. And I think in a lot of ways, you could argue that maybe this is a product of sort of the Frank Capraization of the Senate. By the way, I would note that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is based on a true story of Senator Burton Wheeler from Montana, who did uncover some corruption in public lands projects in the Pacific Northwest. But ironically, the filibuster in real life had nothing to do with his ability to play the underdog and uncover this corruption of the overdog. He did it through hearings and through investigations. But Capra needed a more dramatic demonstration, so he used the filibuster. But that sort of goes to the point that it's never been the filibuster that has been the ability for the Senate to stand up to corporate power or to uncover corruption. It's investigations, it's hearings, it's these other tools that it always has and will continue to have. And I think that, it has become deeply invested in preserving itself in a way that is unhealthy for it as an institution. What it really exists to do is to pass thoughtful, pragmatic policy solutions to the challenges we face. If it ceases to be able to do that, it's going to wind up a failed institution, just like so many others that we see in American life. And the last point I'd make is that I think you can make a strong argument that the filibuster stifles bipartisanship instead of encouraging it. This threshold of 60 votes is relatively arbitrary. It's just sort of where they wound up through a series of compromises. And in today's Senate, divided 50-50, it seems virtually impossible to conceive of any issue where you could attract 10 Republicans while also holding all 50 Democrats. On the other hand, it's a lot easier to think of issues where you could get maybe 2 or 3 Republicans on board with an issue, which today would be sort of a massive bipartisan accomplishment in our polarized era. But getting 2 or 3 Republicans would cause the bill to still fail, even though that would be bipartisanship, because you couldn't reach that arbitrary threshold of 60. So take infrastructure, for example, which we're going to see soon. Very easy to see, Romney, Collins, or Murkowski joining over with Democrats. But because of this arbitrary threshold of 60, that's not enough and the bill will fail. Returning it to 50 will cause bills to pass and will provide the opportunity for a little bit of bipartisanship. Maybe that's baby steps, getting 2 or 3 Republicans on board. But I think that's where you need to start in a polarized era like today. And the last thing I would say on this point is that that's how it used to work. Bills that we think of as these broad bipartisan accomplishments were often fought tooth and nail very aggressively until they could demonstrate that they could secure a majority. And then after it was clear they're going to pass, a bunch more people jumped on board. This was the case with Medicare, which was fought tooth and nail. There's a famous, maybe not famous but to me, but a memo from Mike Manitos, who was LBJ's top legislative aide, writing to the president saying, you can report that Medicare is going to pass because I've been able to identify a majority of the Senate in support of it. After it was clear Medicare was going to pass, a bunch more senators jumped on board, either to get credit or to try to influence the legislation at the last minute. And that ran up the score to 70. But things have to move for there to be any bipartisanship at all. And once things start moving, I think you'll actually see Republicans start to say, well, listen, I can't block this bill. Under the filibuster, I could achieve a net gain for my side by preventing this from passing. But since I can't achieve that, what good does it do me to stand on the sidelines, especially look at something like the ARP, which has 75% support? Is it good for me as a politician to be on the opposite side of an issue that polls that well? Maybe not. Maybe I want to get a little credit. Maybe I want to try to influence the direction of the policy. I'm not saying this will definitely happen, but I think it's more likely that a majority rule Senate will create bipartisanship than a 60 vote Senate, where you're just simply not going to get 60 votes on much of anything.
So, okay, I'm going to take a brief pause here just to remind our audience to please take time and send any question that you have my way or to Andrew Worrell. We're seeing a number of fantastic questions from the audience. So before I turn to those questions, Adam, if I may, I'm going to ask one more, and this is still on the subject of Senator McConnell, because I love your imagery of sort of movement and what the pace could look like, with substantial reform. And I think Senator McConnell's comments this morning actually signal his sense of the opposite. He says, basically that people can't imagine what a scorched earth Senate would look like. And he says, this is not, people might be expecting that the Biden presidency's agenda is going to just sail through, that the Biden presidency will speed into the history books as a result of doing away with the filibuster, or that it will open up an express lane to liberal change. But instead, the Senate will look like a 100-car pileup with nothing moving. And so I'm wondering, what is your sense of the prospect of bipartisan solutions to the filibuster? And maybe even as a second point on this, could we hear a Jentleson plan for reform here? Like, what would your prescription look like?
Yes, definitely. Well, so I think if Senator McConnell might have a little bit of a point there, where I think that the expectation that once the filibuster is gone, there will be this wave of legislation. It's still hard to get a majority to support your legislation in the House, the Senate, and then have the president sign the bill into law and have it be upheld by the courts. That was the system of checks and balances that the framers tried to design. And their whole idea was that was a hard process. And if you take the filibuster out of the equation, our system of democracy still has more what political scientists call veto players than any other modern democracy. So it will still be hard to get things through. I do think you'll see essential things like a voting rights bill pass, action on climate change, action on income inequality, action on infrastructure and spurring job creation. So I think that it's sort of like the Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you can get what you need. I think, once you get rid of the filibuster, America will get what it needs to face some of the challenges that we face today. But I also think that his fear mongering about sort of a scorched earth Senate, when I hear that, I think this is a guy standing in a field of ashes, holding a burnt match. I mean, he is responsible for a lot of this scorched earth tactics. I also think that many Democrats hear that and shrug and say, well, what else is new? I mean, he's already deployed many of these tactics. He did it during the ARP vote, causing the bill to be read, which took about 10 hours. So, Democrats got through that. They voted to pass the bill, and now they say, well, it wasn't so bad. And now we passed a bill that is supported by 75% of the American people. It's probably not a terrible trade. In terms of a plan for reform, I would say, I think filibuster reform is essential. It's obviously the thing that I focus the most on in the book and has gotten a lot of the attention in this conversation for obvious reasons, because people are talking about this question of reform. But I also think that there are other things about the Senate that need to change. I'm critical in the book of the top-down leadership structures, which my own former boss, Senator Reid, imposed in many ways and strengthened. LBJ was the first Senate Majority Leader to really establish this system of control, but Reid certainly strengthened it in his day. McConnell has sort of built on a lot of what Reid created. I think it would be a good thing for the Senate to democratize its power structure and give more power back to individual senators and committees. I'm very critical of the role that money in politics plays. I think we need to end that as much as we possibly can, and certainly end the DC-based control of picking candidates that crowds out a lot of other types of candidates. I think DC has a very outdated but conventional view of what makes a successful candidate. You guys saw it in North Carolina, where Washington's handpicked candidate, Cal Cunningham, did not win. So I think that we need to open up primaries and stop this system of sort of the incumbent protection racket. And I think we need to try to invigorate the Senate's tradition of debate. I propose in the book something sort of like the British Parliament's version of question time, where you basically require senators to have a quorum of senators present on the floor for a certain number of hours before the Senate is able to adjourn for a certain amount of time, say a weekend, so that they'd actually have to be together and talk, and you could potentially have the potential for extemporaneous debate and a free exchange of ideas. Maybe they sit, on the different sides of the chamber, like, competing cliques in a cafeteria. That would be their choice. But I think more probably you would see them actually start to interact with each other, and it would be in full view of the public. And so you'd actually have some open exchange of ideas. And I think that'd be a healthy thing for the institution. So it's not just reforming the filibuster, it's trying to get back to what the Senate was supposed to be, which was a sort of democratic, small d democratic institution where power was distributed pretty horizontally. And it was a free flowing open body where there was real debate and real exchange of ideas.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you so much, Adam. So as a quick pause to say, if you haven't already gotten your copy of 𝗙cie𝗹𝗶𝘁𝗄, we hope that you'll check out our partner, the Regulator Bookstore, to get your copy. So questions from the audience. Adam, first we have someone who says, I've already read and reviewed this wonderful book. It's incredible and it's made me hopeful. How can we get those Democratic senators opposed to change to read this book and change their minds?
Thank you very much for your kind words, questioner. And, I think that there's a conversation going on within the Democratic caucus right now about reform. And, I was very encouraged to see Senator Joe Manchin shift his position even a little bit, but demonstrate an openness to some version of reform. He specifically said that he would potentially be in favor of seeing a talking filibuster where it was, people actually put in the work to wage a filibuster again. So I think that there is a conversation going on. I think, having worked in the Senate, I can attest to the value of phone calls. They are very powerful. Senate offices really do listen to the calls that are coming in. And when one issue starts to generate a higher volume of calls than other issues, that matters. And that has an impact on senators' thinking. So, and in North Carolina, you'll have another race in 2022 where this could be a major issue. So I think telling senators and telling your leaders in Washington that you think this is a important issue is really matters. I think that the going assumption is that something like the filibuster, sort of a wonky procedural, in the weeds issue, won't generate a lot of public attention. But if senators start to see that it actually does, and that people actually care about it, and they do understand that it's an essential change for everything else that they care about, that could actually start to change minds in Washington. But I would say I'm relatively optimistic about the chances of reform. I was there in 2013. We were much farther behind the pace that we are on today in 2013, and we got it done by November of 2013. I would say most of the caucus is already in favor of some kind of a reform. You've got sort of an outer circle of reform-curious senators, and then you've got a very small number of holdouts. But at the end of the day, I think, when it's clear to Joe Manchin and clear to the caucus that he's not, by standing up for the filibuster, he's not blocking Medicare for all or far left priorities. He's blocking this sort of basic centrist building blocks of the Biden administration and the president's agenda. That's when the pressure on him is going to really become acute. And I think probably will lead to at least the beginning of a process of reform, hopefully sometime this year.
Thank you very much. Okay, next question. There are a number of conservative political thinkers and advocates who suggest that keeping the filibuster is the thing to do because it protects the American populace from radical and sweeping changes. In light of January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol, do you feel that there's any merit to this argument that the filibuster protects the country from the threat of violence in response to perceived threats to identity?
So I think it's important not to the questioner's point, not to bury this idea of the protection of minority rights, because this was something that the framers were preoccupied with, and specifically they were afraid that the populace was going to rise up and take their stuff. I mean, protection of private property rights was one of the driving forces behind the protection of minority rights and minority voices that Madison and the other framers put into the Constitution. So I do think it's important to have those protections. But what I think has happened is that they tried to strike a delicate balance between minority protections and majority rule. And what they continually said in the Federalist Papers and other writings was that the minority's voice should be protected. They should have a role in the process. They should have the ability to make their case. But at the end of the day, the Senate should not yield to gridlock. The majority should rule, and the public business should move forward. And the reason they were confident that the majority should be able to rule was that they thought they had designed a system with sufficient checks and balances to prevent the kind of untrammeled majority rule that the questioner is alluding to from taking place. And I guess what I would say is I have faith in that system. I think that there are enough checks and balances to prevent, completely crazy things from passing. Of course, there will be mistakes. People will pass policies that turn out to be bad. That's just part of government, and it happens. But for instance, to use an example, I would look at the effort to repeal Obamacare. So Republicans campaigned on this for 7 years. It was their top priority. And when they came into office, they tried to, one of the first things they tried to do in 2017 was to repeal Obamacare. And they used reconciliation, which allowed them to do an end run around the filibuster. So they only needed a majority to repeal Obamacare. The filibuster didn't help Democrats at all to block this repeal effort. And what Republicans found was that when they tried to repeal it, it was hard to do. Nobody liked Obamacare until Republicans tried to take it away. It was not a popular policy until there was a threat that it would go away and people started to see what the benefits were. And this is consistent throughout history where progressive benefits, expansions of rights, and expansions of the safety net tend to be very popular once they're in place and hard to undo. So I think that, the fact that Republicans couldn't even muster a majority to repeal Obamacare, which they've been promising to do for nearly a decade, goes to show how our system and its requirement of getting majorities in the House, Senate, and then signature of the president still does have sufficient checks and balances, even once you get rid of the filibuster.
All right, fantastic. Okay, next question. Do you see a connection between the continued existence of the filibuster and the lack of term limits? In essence, does the filibuster allow senators to avoid difficult decisions as they hope to extend their stay in the Senate indefinitely?
Yeah, so that to the second part of the question, I would say yes. I'm not personally a fan of term limits because I think that it is one of those policies that actually has the opposite impact of what its intent is. If a senator is limited to 1 term or 2 terms, what will probably happen is that once they get into office, they will realize that they're not accountable to the people who elected them anymore, and they can ignore what those people think. And it does create an incentive for them to cozy up to an industry because they're going to need a job in a few years. And so, they can decide to ignore the will of the people back home, and decide to start doing favors for the financial industry because they know they're going to be out of this job soon and they're going to need another job. And that could lead to even more corruption, even though the intent is to reduce corruption. But I would say to the second part of the question that I do see a connection because I think the filibuster is a fog, creates a fog that diminishes accountability. Both parties, when they're in power, point to the filibuster as a reason that they can't get things done. Democrats, when they were in power under Obama, pointed to the 60 vote requirement as the reason they couldn't enact stricter penalties against Wall Street after the financial crisis. They pointed it to why they couldn't pass more generous policies for working class Americans in the Recovery Act. Part of that is maybe a simple fact, but I think both parties enjoy that shield to prevent them from having to actually do the things they said they were going to do. On the Republican side, they point to it as why they're not going to enact more stricter immigration laws. And these things, getting rid of the filibuster would create more accountability because, let's say we got rid of it tomorrow, Biden would be on the hook for doing the things he promised he was going to do. And, he couldn't blame Republicans for his failure to deliver because it would be possible for him to do it simply with Democratic votes. And so I do think that there is more accountability for our elected officials, and it's sort of a cleaner system where we say, all right, you ran on certain things, let's see you do them, and then let's see if people like them. And if they like them, they can vote for you again. And if they don't like them, they can vote for the other party. But right now, because you have this fog, we lack that accountability. So I do think it would be productive in holding politicians more accountable to the promises that they made and what they ran on.
Next question. Some Republicans blame the current problems with the filibuster on Harry Reid's action during the Obama administration. Do you disagree with that characterization?
I do disagree that that's the reason. I think that they would have done whatever they needed to do to primarily to confirm Trump's judicial appointments, regardless of what Democrats did in 2013. And you could say that this is self-justifying, but I will lay out my reasoning. First of all, when we got rid of the filibuster for most nominees in 2013, that allowed us to confirm a wave of Obama judicial appointments who would not have been otherwise confirmed. Obama at that time was on track to have the fewest judges confirmed of any president since Reagan. When we got rid of the filibuster in November 2013, we used the succeeding year and a half to confirm a bunch of justices. So there are more Obama justices sitting on the court in lifetime appointments today than there would have been if we hadn't got rid of it. Fast forward to 2017, Republicans come into power. If, let's say, we had left the filibuster in place, there would have been fewer Obama justices on the bench. And then the first time Democrats filibustered something, a Trump appointee, McConnell could have just gone nuclear himself. And you could certainly argue that our action made it easier for McConnell to get the one thing we left in place was the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. So McConnell had to get rid of that when 𝗙𝗁𝘁 was nominated. And you could certainly argue that our actions made it easier for McConnell to get rid of that threshold. And you certainly could argue that it made it easier for him to go nuclear in general. But I think if you sort of play that scenario out and you think, what would happen in March of 2017 when Democrats were filibustering some Trump appointment? We know how much McConnell cares about judicial appointments. This is his entire legacy really rests on that. And it's been his number one priority. If the idea that McConnell would have let Democrats continue filibustering all of Trump's appointees without somehow finding the votes to go nuclear, to me is an argument against evidence and everything that we know about him and how he has behaved. So I think that it's a bit of a stretch, but you could certainly make that argument that McConnell would have just let Democrats filibuster his nominees and thrown up his hands and said, "I give up." But I somehow don't think that's how it would have played out.
So Chris, another great question. Why would Senator Manchin want to get rid of the filibuster? With it, he's the most powerful senator in the whole body and one of the most influential people in Washington, able to place his imprint on every piece of legislation.
Well, I actually think that the reverse is true. I think that once you get rid of the filibuster, then he's the most powerful person in Washington. Right now, he is holding up things from passing, and he's sort of got his finger in one piece of the dam, but that's blocking all these other things from happening. If you get rid of the filibuster, you need 50 votes to pass everything, and then you need Manchin's vote for every single thing that you want to pass. Right now, he's holding back a bunch of other things, but that's not how you get things as a senator. You get things when bills actually pass, and you can get your pet project for West Virginia, or you can get your pilot project that you've been working on your whole career put into this bill. So if you got rid of the filibuster and things actually started passing, take infrastructure, for example. People on social media were joking that, West Virginia would look like Wakanda by the time we were done with it. I mean, he could get, Robert Byrd, his predecessor, was a, bring home the bacon in a big way for West Virginia. You would have bridges and tunnels and schools with Manchin's name all over them in West Virginia. But he won't get that as long as the filibuster remains in place, because those bills won't pass. So there are many issues that he cares about, but I would actually argue that he becomes more powerful when he is that key 50th vote for actually passing bills, rather than just the guy who's holding everything up. There's no question that when if he decides to shift on the filibuster, he'll negotiate something big for that shift, and then for every other shift after that. But you don't get anything that's lasting and meaningful until bills start passing.
So Adam, quick question. Have you spoken with Chuck Schumer and or Joe Manchin about your book?
I haven't spoken with Joe Manchin, and I've had several conversations with some of my former colleagues in the Senate about the book and about the issue of reform. But a lot of those conversations are between us. And so I think I'm going to leave it there.
Another question. So earlier on, you talked about that process where leaders might go, or someone who's going to propose a bill can ask members of their caucus, hey, do you plan to filibuster? So someone asks, can the public get timely access to the names of senators who respond to those emails saying, yeah, I plan to filibuster?
No, you cannot. And there's just no way. I mean, it's not, I don't, think it should be that way. But the Senate makes its own rules, and, that's sort of a black box that it will probably always protect. The public could try to demand access and demand more transparency there. But actually, I would say that the way to get that information is to get rid of the filibuster. And sorry to be a one-trick pony here, but without this silent filibuster, senators actually had to go to the floor and be on the floor giving a speech in order to delay a bill. Part of the reason the filibuster was used infrequently in the past was that senators didn't want to do that against popular issues. Blocking civil rights was actually popular in the South for these, senators who were trying to get elected there. But generally, you didn't want to go to the floor and block the GI Bill or block, some Medicare. So, today, if you got rid of the filibuster, another way it would increase accountability is that if anybody wanted to block something, the only way they could do that would be to actually go to the floor, which they were welcome to do, and explain to the public their reasons. And if the public decided that they thought this was a bad move and this person should be voted out of office, they would have that information. But the ability to do it in secret right now, under the current system, I don't think they'll ever disclose that information. But if you reform the filibuster and say you actually got to go to the floor to do it, that would sort of be another way of getting at it.
So I think we're nearing the end of our time. Adam, if I may ask you two final quick questions. Okay, one, do you believe that the Senate can ever be truly democratic or representative, especially since there seems to be such a misrepresentation of lived experiences in modern day American society?
It'll take a long time to get there. There are things besides the filibuster, primarily this equal representation, which, by the way, James Madison opposed. The great champion of minority rights at the Constitutional Convention said that this was a grave source of injustice. He wanted the Senate to be proportional to its representation. That was at a time when the biggest state was 10 times the size of the smallest state. So if he thought it was injustice then, he certainly would think it was injustice today when the biggest state is 70 times the size of the smallest state. It's going to take a lot of time. And I think that's true about many institutions in American life that are deeply unrepresentative of the lived experience of most Americans. However, I think that the only way to get it closer to being accurately representative of America is to eliminate the filibuster so that we can pass things like statehood for 𝗙cie and Puerto Rico, pass bills to combat voter suppression, and start to get at some of these structural imbalances that create this lack of representation that you're talking about.
And final question for you, Adam. Can you tell us a little bit about the Battle-Born Collective?
Yes, thank you for asking. So this is a new nonprofit that I started in January. And, what I'm trying to do with a partner of mine, a woman named Rebecca Katz, who is a former Reid veteran, in addition to me. So we've tried to, in the private sector, you have this industry called political intelligence where corporations pay a lot of money for organizations that will sort of get the lay of the land and sort of tell them what a given legislative path looks like and help them develop a legislative strategy. But no one's doing that for folks who don't have a lot of money, and for nonprofit groups and progressive groups like, the Sunrise Movement, Justice Democrats, Indivisible, folks like that. Battle-Born is a group that works with a lot of those groups that I mentioned. And our goal is to provide that sort of insider intelligence to sort of the nonprofit liberal activist sphere for free. We're grant funded, so we're not client-based. We don't charge the groups that we work with any money, but we do provide them with that insider intelligence and help them develop effective legislative strategies to do what they want to do. So we're brand new. We just started, but it's going very well. And it's been a fun experience so far.
That sounds fantastic. So to get your very own copy of 𝗙cie𝗹𝗶𝘁, we hope you will visit the Regulator Bookshop. That is the dedicated bookseller for tonight's event. And we have popped the link to the Regulator and how to get the book in the chat. So please check it out. We are especially grateful, Polis, the Center for Politics, and the Sanford School of Public Policy, to our very special guest, Adam Jentleson, Executive Director of the Battle-Born Collective and former Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator Harry Reid, the author of 𝗙cie𝗹𝗶𝘁. We're also grateful to the Regulator Bookshop, to Professor Mac McCorkle, Professor Bruce Jentleson, Polis's Program Coordinator Anna Kinnear, to 𝗙cie𝗹𝗶𝘁𝗲𝗏 at Live Right Publishing Corps, Polis Directors Fellows Andrew Worrell and Jessica Owen, who've given us amazing support backstage for tonight's event. Thank you so much, Andrew and Jessica. And to all of our audience members, thanks so much for being with us tonight. We hope you will join us again at our next Polis virtual event on Wednesday, March 31st from 6 to 7. And we're having a discussion about politics and leadership. It'll be our very final installment of this year's Polis Innovation Accelerator Speaker Series. And we'll have a panel of political and policy experts talking about their national, state, and local level political and policy experiences and their insights into how you can be a leader in politics and policy. So thank you again for being with us tonight. Thank you so much again, Adam. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.